Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video I want to take a look at an article by Richard Rorty, and the article is called Solidarity or Objectivity. Solidarity or objectivity. That's a sort of strange opposition, right? I mean, usually we would think that the opposite of solidarity is egoism and the opposite of objectivity is subjectivity or something like that. Okay, so what does Rorty mean by this? Well, one thing I would like to start out saying is that the title is a little bit misleading because of the word or. It turns out that Rorty doesn't want us to choose between solidarity and objectivity. Rather, he wants us to choose which of those is more fundamental. And he's going to present to us two kinds of philosophers. One kind who believes that objectivity is more fundamental than solidarity, and one kind who believes that solidarity is more fundamental than objectivity. But both kinds of philosophers want both, right? So they both want both solidarity and objectivity. It's just that they have a different philosophical theory about which of these two is more fundamental. Okay, what does that mean? Well, here is what the distinction between these two people that Rorty is thinking about. Suppose that we think of objectivity as something that we get when we remove ourselves, so to speak, from our own community. So instead of thinking as, let's say, an ancient Greek from Athens or a 21st century Dutchman, instead of thinking like that, like my community, what I want to do is I want to step outside of that community and use tools of inquiry that are completely independent of that community in order to get at the truth, right? In order to get at the way the world is in itself, independently of what any particular people tend to think about it. That would be the desire for objectivity, as Rorty understands it. And the person who thinks in this way is the person whom Rorty calls a realist. And so for the realist, truth is correspondence with a reality that is independent of human beings, and in particular that is independent of our ways of inquiry. Right? There's reality, truth is correspondence with reality, and then, okay, sure, of course, we have ways of inquiry that are meant to get us to that reality, right? That are meant to get us to that truth, but the reality and the truth are independent of the ways of inquiry, right? I mean, there's no, this is the logically first thing, the truth, the reality, and then we try to get there by developing the right tools for getting there. So that's what the realist thinks. And then when it comes to ethics and politics, Rorty says, well, the realist tends to think that we have to ground, to build them on these objective insights that we got. And so a typical realist move here is to say, well, from our objective point of view, we have seen that human beings have inalienable rights, and that's why solidarity is necessary. Right? Something like that. That's a way in which solidarity might be grounded on objectivity. Okay, so that's one way of thinking. It's the realist way of thinking. The other way of thinking is what, we might call the anti-realist way of thinking, and that wouldn't in fact be wrong. I mean, there is something called anti-realism about truth, which is basically the kind of view that we're about to describe. But Rorty is really only interested in a particular version of that, his own version, which he calls pragmatism. So what is pragmatism? Well, pragmatism is the idea that we should reduce objectivity to solidarity. What does that mean? Well, it means that we take our community very seriously. And we take the norms of our community very seriously. And we want to research the world using the norms that we have. Right, the best ways of investigating the world that we have been able to think up until now and that we as a community accept, that's what we want to apply. Okay, and what is objectivity? Well, objectivity is what we arrive at by using those norms. right? The truth is what we arrive at by using those norms. Reality is what we arrive at by using those norms. That's what, and now I'm speaking and not Rorty, that's what truth and reality are, right? They're the end point of the use of our norms. I'm speaking at me, not as Rorty, because Rorty claims in this article, and he claims it not only in this article, that he doesn't really have a view about truth or reality. All he really wants to talk about is our specific local norms and what we do with them and whether we should change them and how we should change them and so on and so forth. But he doesn't want to talk about truth with a big T or reality with a big R. So in fact, he goes as far as to claim here in this article that he doesn't have an epistemology and he doesn't have a metaphysics. I don't know whether I go along with that, to be honest. I mean, being a pragmatist, it sounds like having an epistemology. It's just not a realist epistemology, right? It's not an epistemology that starts out with truth and reality and then tries to tell us a story about how we get there. It's an epistemology that starts out with our actual ethical standards, our norms of inquiry, and then, defines truth and reality in terms of that. Well, that's at least the way that I'm thinking about this. But Rorty doesn't want us to think about that in precisely those terms, right? He prefers to say that he doesn't have a theory of truth or reality. Here is something extremely important to understand about the kind of pragmatism that Rorty is pushing. It's not static, right? When Rorty talks about our norms, our ways of inquiry, he is not thinking of something that is static, given once and for all, and, take it or leave it. On the contrary, he's thinking of something that is essentially dynamic, right? It is part of our norms of inquiry that we are always, willing to rethink our norms of inquiry, right? Some of the things that we are doing might not be working very well. And we, sort of test norms against each other. We critically think through the way that we are doing science, for instance. And we probably also talk to people who have different ideas, who have other ideas, right? We are going to talk to people who say, well, let's try this. Or people who say, well, in the past they did that and it also seemed to work. And we try to see whether we can incorporate those ideas into our own practice. So when Rorty talks about truth, what he doesn't mean is, that what you're going to find is if you use our current norms of inquiry, right? Never changing them. No, I mean, this is supposed to be a dynamic and interactive thing where we continually improve not only our knowledge of the world, but also our methods of gaining knowledge, right? Okay. So, of course, the realist likes that too, right? The realist also likes the idea of improving our norms of inquiry. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is, here's what the realist would say, right? The realist would say, improving our norms of inquiry means making them such that they bring us closer to reality, right? So in order to even understand the idea of improving our norms of inquiry, we need to start from the idea of the truth or the idea of reality being independent from our norms of inquiry. That's what gives us the standard for our norms of inquiry. So the realist wants to tell a story where we have a sort of external perspective on our norms. And we say whether those norms are good or bad, that depends on whether they bring us to this antecedently given reality. Well, it's antecedently given in thought. It's not really given to us except through our norms of inquiry, right? We don't have a grasp of reality except by inquiring about it, but we can at least think, sort of the abstract thought of, well, there's reality, there's what we know with our current norms. Well, do they fit, right? I mean, is it the same thing? The realist think that that's the right picture to have. The anti-realist, the pragmatist, thinks that that's not the right picture to have, right? The pragmatist wants to stay much more local, right? Wants to stay inside our norms of inquiry. And, what is the truth? The truth is what we're trying to get at when we inquire. When we successfully inquire, that's the truth. the kind of inquiry that is never going to come in for criticism. That's the inquiry that leads to truth. And of course, it's also possible for the pragmatist to say what we believe now might not be true. Because what we believe now, it might have followed from our current norms of inquiry, but we're continually trying to change and improve them. And so maybe in the future, it's going to turn out that we have to change our beliefs. And then that means that they're false, right? And that those new beliefs are maybe the truth. So in practice, I would say there's not a lot of difference between what a realist scientist and a pragmatist scientist would actually do. They're both trying to get at the truth. They're both trying to do that by sort of using our norms of inquiry and improving those norms of inquiry. It's only when they tell a philosophical story that things are different, right? Where the realist says, well, there's this reality that we're trying to get at, and our norms of inquiry are good only if they actually bring us there. And the pragmatist says, well, we're trying to improve our norms of inquiry by continually testing them against each other and talking to other people. That is what good inquiry is, and that's what brings us to the truth. And because this is a never-ending process, we can never say, oh, we have arrived at the truth. But the truth is either sort of independent of us, or it is something that exists only as a sort of ideal endpoint of our practices. That's the philosophical difference here. In particular, it's important not to understand the pragmatist as somebody who is against truth or who devalues truth or who doesn't want truth or something like that. No. But philosophically speaking, the pragmatist starts with our forms of epistemic practice, our norms. And philosophically, the realist starts with reality independently of us. Right? And so philosophically, it's a different story. In practice, it's not a very different story. Okay. Now, Rorty tells us that the realist tends to accuse the pragmatist of being a relativist. Okay, so what's a relativist? Well, there are a couple of things that we might mean by relativism. Only one of which, Rorty says, is something that the pragmatist actually believes. So here is something that the pragmatist actually believes. It's the view that there is nothing to be said about either truth or rationality apart from descriptions of the familiar procedures of justification that a given society, ours, uses in one or another area of inquiry. So the view that the pragmatist holds is if somebody asks us, well, what is the right way to study the world? Right? Then the only thing we can do is to explain to him how we study the world. Right? What we think are the best norms for studying the world. So we can explain the scientific method, and we can explain very specific aspects even of the scientific method. Right? How do archaeologists right now interpret the stone tools that they find in the Paleolithic? I mean, that would be a norm, right? Or a set of norms even. That's explaining how we get to reality. The realist might say, well, what you should do is you should use procedures that bring you to the truth. That's kind of empty, right? The pragmatist would say that doesn't really add anything. And if we ask the realist to be more specific, he's going to end up telling the exact same story that the pragmatist tells about our actual local norms. So the pragmatist holds the view that, if somebody asks us about truth, we have to tell them the story of our current norms. But there's nothing relativistic about that, right? It's not that we have said that truth is relative to something. Okay, but here's another kind of person who's not the pragmatist, but the real relativist, said in a spooky voice, the relativist. So what the relativist says is that there are different sets of social of epistemic norms, and all those sets of epistemic norms lead to a different truth, and so there are different truths, which are even incompatible with each other, and all of which are equally good. Right? There are different sets of epistemic norms. You can't really say that any of those is better than the others because, well, they're just different. They lead to different truths. Those truths are incompatible with each other, but they're all equally good. That's a sort of classic relativism. Yeah. And Rorty thinks it's a disaster. Right? Rorty thinks that it's absolutely wrong to have that kind of story. It's self-defeating. I mean, because, you know, some of those epistemic norms are going to lead to the conclusion that relativism is false, presumably. So it's self-defeating. You end up having to condone like logical inconsistencies, I suppose. And who would want this, right? Who would want to have a philosophical position where what you have to say is, well, there's my epistemic norms, but there are also other people's epistemic norms, and they're just as good as mine. I mean, if you really say that, then your epistemic norms are not yours, right? Because if you think that another norm is just as good as your own, then you're accepting them both. But they're not this. I mean, if they tell you to do different things, then you're just in a completely inconsistent, terrible situation. Okay, so Rorty thinks that this kind of relativism would be a big problem, but he doesn't think the pragmatist is there, right? Because he thinks the pragmatist embraces something that Rorty calls ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism in Rorty is the idea that we always have to start from where we are, right? When I think about norms, when I wonder whether an epistemic norm is good or bad, I start from my current epistemic norms. Doesn't mean that I'm always going to conclude that my current epistemic norms are the right ones, right? Because my epistemic norms might have tensions, problems. In fact, they might allow me to see that some other epistemic norm is better and that I should change how I think, right? I can kick out one of my epistemic norms and put in something else, for instance. And that's something that my epistemic norms as a whole might tell me to do. And in fact, it would be a very good idea to talk to other people, right? And see if we can learn from each other and get better norms that way. So Rorty absolutely doesn't believe that we are sort of caught in, imprisoned in a particular culture or paradigm or something like that. And that therefore we only have the truth of that culture or the truth of that paradigm or something like that. But he does think that, you know, when we think about norms and truth, we start from where we are, right? And then we try to get to a better place and a better place. But it's always better by the lights of where we are now, right? We are trying to improve our situation, and our only guide, like we don't have the truth as a sort of transcendent guide, right? I can't set a step and then check whether I'm closer to the truth. I can only contemplate a step and see whether it's an improvement from my current way of thinking. And interestingly, our current ways of thinking are not static. They allow for self-improvement. So that's the story of how the pragmatist is different from the relativist. Rorty then spends some time discussing Hilary Putnam's book Reason, Truth and History. And basically he tells us that he agrees with Putnam and that Putnam agrees with him, but that Putnam didn't realize it. So Putnam spends some time in that book arguing against Rorty and arguing against relativists and pragmatists and so on and so forth, because he believes that they actually succumb to some kind of relativism maybe. They succumb to the idea that there are these different cultures which have just different norms, all of which are sort of closed systems leading to their own truth. And Rorty says, oh, I completely agree with Putnam that that's a terrible view, and it's not a view that I hold, and it's not a view that pragmatism holds, because pragmatists are not relativists, but ethnocentrists. Okay. Here is what I want to do in the rest of this video. I want to look at the way that that Rorty understands the sort of trouble, the sort of problem that people tend to have with pragmatism. So people tend to especially of course people coming from realism, tend to believe that there's that pragmatism takes away something important, right? What is that? Well, is it the objective truth? Okay, Rorty is going to say that, well, you know, the only access that any of us has to the objective truth is through our own epistemic norms, right? So pragmatism doesn't take anything away from you that you possessed, right? It takes away from you only a certain philosophical picture, but not one that you could actually use in inquiry or science, or you're thinking about inquiry or science or something like that. But here is something that pragmatism actually takes away from you. It takes away from you the nice thought that we human beings, and especially we human beings, right, the heirs of modern science and the Enlightenment and the tradition of philosophy and maybe the tradition of social progress or one thing or something else, that we human beings are moving towards a place that is sort of prepared for us, right? It's the truth, it's there, right? That's our birthright in a sense. That we're moving towards something that's in a sense prepared for us and that human beings naturally seek. Right? And that's a very nice idea. It's a nice idea in part because if that's what human beings naturally seek, then it's basically inevitable that we'll end up there. Right? There could be setbacks. There could be economic disasters. There could be political disasters, tyrannies, mind control, who knows what, that are setbacks in our sort of attempt to develop science, get a truth, develop like the objective like story about human rights and the ethical world and so on and so forth. But because it is the birthright and aim and natural sort of tendency of human beings to get there to the objective truth, people will in the end sort of find their way back. And the future of humanity is to be people just like us, except better. Right? People just like us, except better. Okay, says Rorty, I mean, that is something that pragmatism can't give you. So, ethnocentrism can be experienced as what Rorty calls, on page 176, a lonely provincialism. Right? What we can say is that our norms, us, right, the heirs of modern science, the Enlightenment, the philosophical tradition, and so on, that for us, it's important to ensure that that we develop science and free inquiry, and we develop societies where people are allowed to live their own lives and are not exploited for the gain of others, and so on and so forth. And we're right to do so. Right? We're right to do so. That's what our norms are telling us. But there's nothing that we know about sort of reality or humanity that proves that humans are always going to think this way or are always going to progress in this direction. And so it's possible that we go extinct, right? Not humanity as a species, but we as people who think this way and who have these norms and who are developing these norms in ever further directions. That's possible, right? The future could be very bad. The people of the future could be people very unlike us, whom we cannot recognize as better versions of ourselves. So there's this almost religious comfort in realism, which is the idea that the way that we are trying to get at the world is universal and inevitable. Well, no, Rorty says. It's historical, it's contingent. The future might not be the way that we would like it to be. And so that could be a problem. I mean, pragmatism does take something away from you, a kind of metaphysical comfort. And instead of that, it gives you a heightened sense of solidarity, right? That this is the community of people who, in at least some ways, think like us, that we have to cultivate, that we have to work together with in order to ensure that the future of humanity is what we would like the future of humanity to be, and in fact what our norms tell us it is good for the future of humanity to be. So that's, we could say, the sense in which solidarity is more fundamental than objectivity. All right, thank you.